My life didn't just fall apart. It was meticulously dismantled, piece by deliberate piece, like an antique clock being taken apart for scrap. I used to think I lived a solid, stable existence in Atlanta, Georgia. We had a 2-bedroom condo near Midtown, where the walls were just thin enough that you could hear the city breathing at night, but thick enough that you felt safe inside. I was Eleanor Vance, a marketing coordinator who hit her deadlines, contributed equally to the mortgage, and believed in the stability of a reliable routine. I was approaching my late 40s, the stage of life where you stop chasing excitement and start appreciating comfort. Bryce Sterling, my husband of 7 years, was a business consultant. His schedule, full of late-night calls and weekend trips to secure seed funding for various tech startups, felt like a testament to his ambition. I admired him, covered him with a blanket when he fell asleep exhausted on the couch, and felt that strange, warm blend of affection and loneliness that comes with long-term partnership. Then there was Chelsea Hayes, my best friend since college, my maid of honor, the one person I thought was my anchor. Every Thursday night, she'd show up with a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc, and we'd sit on my sectional, deconstructing my work dramas, her latest dating disasters, and my creeping suspicion that Bryce and I were starting to drift apart. "All marriages have phases, Elle," she'd say, giving me a knowing look. "You're lucky to have a man that steady. Don't take it for granted." I believed her because questioning Chelsea felt like questioning gravity. The collapse began 6 months ago, not with a bang, but with a cold, metallic dread that settled in my stomach. I took an early afternoon off work, telling my boss, Greg Harmon, I had the flu. Greg, a distant, efficient man, just offered a clipped, unreadable "feel better" that in retrospect sounded more like relief. The 20-minute drive home was silent. When I pulled into the condo parking lot, I saw Chelsea's silver coupe in the visitor space. It shouldn't have felt wrong. She had a key, but that knot in my stomach tightened until I couldn't breathe. I sat in my car, cycling through innocent explanations. They're working on a surprise party. Bryce came homesick too. I let myself in quietly. The apartment was occupied quiet, the kind of stillness that broadcasts presence. Then I heard it coming from our bedroom, a soft, intimate chuckle. Chelsea's laugh, but not the one she used watching comedies with me. This one was reserved, designed to make one specific person feel desired. I didn't knock. I just turned the handle and pushed. They were in my bed, tangled in the duvet I'd bought on sale, looking at each other with an intimacy that takes years to cultivate. But what shattered me wasn't the sight of their betrayal, it was the look on Chelsea's face. Annoyance, like I was the rude interruption, not the violated party. Bryce pulled on his jeans with the smooth, practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times. He had the audacity to try to manage the situation. "Sam, Eleanor, we need to talk about this like adults. This isn't what it looks like." The absurdity of his gaslighting in that moment was breathtaking. It was exactly what it looked like. Chelsea, holding the sheet to her chest, said with mock pity, "Honestly, Elle, this has been coming for a long time. You had to know things weren't working. The betrayal, the manipulation, the sheer nerve of her. It stole my breath and replaced it with cold, hard clarity." I didn't scream. I didn't cry then. I simply turned, walked to the hall closet, and pulled out a duffel bag. I packed the essentials, my laptop, a few changes of clothes, toiletries, the practical things you need when the foundation of your entire reality disintegrates. I walked out of the apartment I had helped pay for without another word. Within 2 weeks, the collapse accelerated. Greg Harmon called me into his office to explain the restructuring, using that careful corporate language to fire me. The divorce proceedings, led by Bryce's expensive, cruel attorney, left me with virtually nothing. My job loss and temporary housing situation were weaponized against me. All the material stability gone. But the worst part? Watching Chelsea sit on the stand, wearing a navy designer suit we'd picked out together, lying with practiced conviction about my instability and paranoia. She destroyed the last shreds of my credibility, and the judge, Robert Cunningham, approved every motion against me. I ended up at the Starlight Inn, off Highway 57, room 212. It charged by the week, smelled of industrial cleaner fighting a losing war with cigarette smoke, and the bed sagged in the middle like a tired soul. Rock bottom wasn't a sudden fall. It was a slow, humiliating grind. I had gone from middle-class stability to a $50 a night motel in less than 2 months. The only thing I knew for sure was that I was utterly alone, and everyone who had mattered had decided I was too much trouble. I had lost everything I thought defined me. The Starlight Inn, room 212. It was my address now. My entire life fit into a duffel bag and a cardboard box. The carpet was a tapestry of ancient, unidentifiable stains, and the air conditioner unit rattled a desperate, lonely rhythm. I had scraped together $200 from freelance social media work, managing the Facebook page for a local pet groomer and a struggling bakery, but the payments were always irregular. The $50 weekly rate was the only stability I had left, a brutal, minimal anchor in a sea of chaos. Rita, the woman at the front desk, had a name tag and an expression of profound, exhausted indifference. She didn't ask questions. She just took the cash and recited the rules. Checkout is 11 a.m., no visitors after 10 p.m., vending machines take exact change. In a way, her indifference was a mercy. The motel didn't pretend to care, and that was better than the temporary sympathy of my former friends, who had abandoned me the moment my crisis became inconvenient. They all had prior commitments, family obligations, or needed to focus on their own mental health. I realized how conditional most relationships are. They expire when compassion requires sustained sacrifice. My days were a punishing routine designed to prevent total collapse. I'd wake up early, make instant coffee with the sputtering machine provided, and spend the mornings applying for jobs, marketing roles, coordinator positions, anything remotely related to my 4 years at Brennan and Associates. I customized dozens of cover letters every week, tailoring my resume to match whatever corporate buzzword was trending. But my applications disappeared into a digital void. No calls back, not even rejection emails. It was as if Eleanor Vance had been erased from the professional world. Afternoons were dedicated to the miserable freelance gigs, which barely covered the rent and provided just enough left over for food. Dinner was usually instant ramen, sometimes splurging on a can of soup from the convenience store 2 blocks away. I'd eat on the edge of the sagging bed, watching television, shows I didn't care about, desperate for any noise that wasn't the sound of my own spiraling thoughts. I avoided the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back had the same eyes, the same jawline, but something fundamental had broken behind her gaze, leaving a hollow, defeated look that made me ashamed. This was the landscape of systematic destruction. Rooms smelling of failure, meals costing less than $2, and the chilling certainty that I was utterly and comprehensively alone. It was 3 weeks into my tenancy at room 212 that the ordinary led to the extraordinary. I dropped my phone charger. It rolled directly under the bed frame, disappearing into the dust and shadows. I got down on my hands and knees, reaching into the dark space between the mattress and the floor. My hand hit something solid, something that shouldn't have been there. I dragged it out into the dim light. It was an old suitcase, battered, dark brown leather with oxidized brass corners. It looked like it belonged to a different era, before travel meant plastic rollers and disposable bags. Attached to the handle was a luggage tag, secured with fraying twine. My hand started shaking before I even turned the tag over. Eleanor Marie Vance. My full name, written in a precise, careful script I recognized instantly. It was the handwriting of my Aunt Vivian Thorne. Vivian, my mother's older sister. The eccentric family member everyone dismissed as difficult, paranoid, and a conspiracy theorist. She died 9 months earlier alone in her house, surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers. I'd felt guilty at her funeral for not visiting more, for writing her off as a harmless eccentric when maybe, just maybe, she had seen patterns the rest of us were too comfortable to notice. How had her suitcase ended up under my bed in a motel room I had only occupied for 21 days? Had she planned for this? Had she left instructions? The logistics were impossible, yet the evidence was right here, my name written by her unmistakable hand. The suitcase was locked with 2 brass latches. I flipped it over, checking the sides and bottom, and found a small, clear plastic bag securely taped underneath. Inside the bag was a single key. Vivian had always been paranoid, yes, but also intensely practical. She hid things in plain sight, trusting that the right person, the one who needed it, would look close enough to find the clue. I peeled off the tape, my breath catching in my throat, and fitted the key into the lock. My fingers trembled as I turned it. The lock mechanism clicked open with a decisive mechanical sound, a small, sharp finality in the oppressive silence of room 212. I threw back the lid. The suitcase, meant for a lifetime of possessions, contained only 3 things, and they instantly changed the entire axis of my world. First, money. Not neatly stacked, but bundled with thick rubber bands, mostly crisp $100 bills with some 50s mixed in. $75,000 in cash. It smelled faintly of mothballs and old paper, the scent of something meticulously stored for years. Second, a flight ticket, a printed itinerary on paper, slightly yellowed at the edges. Portland, Oregon. Departure date, 4 days from now. Third, underneath the ticket, a sheet of yellow legal paper folded into quarters. A handwritten note in Aunt Vivian's familiar, distinctive script. I picked up the note. The cash was a shock, but the paper held the true terror. I read the words, my eyes blurring, trying to reconcile them with the 7 years of history I thought I knew. Eleanor, the note began, simple and direct. This is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. A specific Portland address was written below. Then the warning, the bullet points that detonated the foundations of my life. Do not trust Bryce. Do not trust Chelsea. They've been planning your destruction since before your wedding. Your mother, Charlotte's death 6 years ago, was not an accident. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her. It ended with, "The truth is important. Use it wisely." I read the words 3 times. They were impossible, yet they resonated with the deep, cold dread I'd felt on the morning I found Bryce and Chelsea. My mother's death. The police report had been conclusive. A tragic car accident on a rainy night, excessive speed, possibly falling asleep at the wheel. But Vivian, the family eccentric, had always insisted something was wrong. She'd shown up to gatherings with pamphlets about corporate corruption, warning me, "Be careful who you trust, Eleanor." I had dismissed it as paranoia as everyone else had. Now, I was sitting on the floor of a dirty motel room, holding $75,000 and a note that declared my entire life was a lie orchestrated by a dead woman's enemies. Bryce hadn't met me by chance. He hadn't fallen in love with me naturally. He and Chelsea had been planning this since before our wedding. I hadn't been a wife. I had been a target, a mark, an entry point for something far larger than simple adultery. The betrayal hadn't just been personal. It had been calculated, part of a conspiracy connected to my mother's death and whatever Vivian had spent her final years investigating. I spent the next 48 hours in room 212 staring at the money and the note. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. The magnitude of the deception was paralyzing. If this was true, I was not a victim of bad luck. I was a casualty of a calculated, years-long operation. Vivian had died 9 months ago. She spent her final years collecting evidence, while everyone called her crazy. Now, she was offering me a choice. Take the money and disappear. Change my identity. Live comfortably and safely run from the wreckage. Nobody would blame me. Or use it to fight back, to confront the people who had destroyed my life and murdered my mother. I forced myself to think clearly, to move past the initial shock. If Vivian was right, running meant letting them win, letting them erase my mother's memory and my dignity. I was done being the person things happened to. I was done disappearing while my betrayers moved on without consequence. I was Eleanor Vance, and I realized in that dusty, smoke-stained room that I was finally done being naive. I wasn't running. I was fighting. I packed my duffel bag one final time. The essentials, my laptop, and the $75,000 bundled securely. I paid Rita for the rest of the week, leaving a note that I wouldn't be returning. She gave me a single, quiet good luck, a word that could mean anything, and I walked out of the Starlight Inn, room 212, for the last time. My destination was Portland, Oregon. My purpose was to uncover the truth Aunt Vivian had promised, and my heart, cold and hard, was ready to begin the long war. The lie wasn't a spontaneous moment of weakness. It was a performance spanning 7 years, and now, standing in the chaos of my new reality, I needed to dissect it. I spent the bus ride to the regional airport and the brutal hours waiting for my budget flight, replaying the last decade of my life like a detective reviewing security footage. Every moment with Bryce, every conversation with Chelsea, I needed to find the glitches in the matrix. Bryce and I had supposedly met 7 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party in Atlanta. He was charming, attentive, and unlike most men I'd dated, he listened when I talked about my work. He proposed 18 months later in Piedmont Park, getting down on one knee in the precise spot where we'd had our third date. It felt natural, easy, destined. But the note, planning your destruction since before your wedding, meant that dinner party, that proposal, that life was all a set constructed for my benefit. Looking back, the signs had been there, subtle shifts I'd convinced myself were normal marital fatigue. Bryce became protective of his phone, tilting the screen away when I walked past, taking calls outside, and always setting it face down during dinner. He was vaguer about his business trips and his East Coast clients, offering broad descriptions where he once shared detailed, ambitious stories. And he picked fights, irrational, draining arguments about the way I loaded the dishwasher or whether we should buy the organic vegetables. These fights, I now realize, were designed to create distance, to make the marriage feel rocky, so that when the affair was exposed, I would internalize Chelsea's assessment. You had to know things weren't working. That Tuesday, the day I found them, replayed constantly. I remember the cold dread in my chest, the feeling of a profound wrongness that sat deeper than any stomach flu. When I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom, watching the scene unfold, I had been looking for guilt. I had been braced for tears, apologies, panic. But what I got was indifference, annoyance, and immediate damage control. Bryce's calm, practiced voice. "We need to talk about this like adults." That was the key. Not the sex, not the betrayal, but the lack of shame. He wasn't heartbroken, he was impatient. He wasn't guilty, he was relieved the pretense was over. He was ready to execute phase 2 of his strategy, which involved gaslighting me into accepting a mature conversation about a situation he had orchestrated. Chelsea's statement, "This has been coming for a long time," was the scripted justification, the narrative meant to make me doubt my own sanity and accept responsibility for their infidelity. Then there was the chilling coordination of the aftermath. I lost my job immediately. Greg Harmon, my distant boss, was revealed much later to have been Bryce's college roommate, a connection that meant my job was never secure, always conditional. The divorce was a surgical strike, with every detail of my life used as ammunition. Chelsea's testimony was not the act of a friend feeling compelled to confess, but the calculated performance of an operative completing her final mission, ensuring I was legally and financially annihilated. As the budget carrier climbed over the clouds, shaking slightly with turbulence, I clutched the duffel bag holding Vivian's cash. The lie had been architectural, the job, the friendship, the marriage, all built on foundations that were never real, designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. They saw me as useful, a path to information, not as a human being. My mother, Charlotte, had died 6 years ago. Vivian's note claimed it wasn't an accident. I remembered Vivian at the funeral, pulling me aside, her voice urgent despite her own grief. She'd insisted Charlotte was investigating financial fraud at the pharmaceutical company where she worked, saying the timing was too convenient. I had pulled away, whispering that she was being paranoid. Now, the weight of that dismissal, the guilt of not listening to the one person who saw the whole pattern, felt heavier than the betrayal itself. I realized I hadn't just lost a life, I had lost the opportunity to avenge my mother's death sooner. But Vivian had waited. She had built a contingency plan, and now I was flying across the country to execute it. The thought didn't bring me joy or vengeance. It brought me cold, resolute purpose. I was no longer running from them. I was running towards the truth. Portland, Oregon, greeted me with a cold, gray sky and a biting rain, starkly different from the humid heat of Atlanta. This was the kind of wetness that seeped through clothing and settled deep into your bones, making me feel exposed and vulnerable. I rented a cheap car using Aunt Vivian's cash and drove out of the city, heading toward Lake Oswego, a quiet suburb where money bought privacy and neighbors who minded their own business. The GPS guided me through streets lined with mature trees and houses set far back from the road, each property maintaining a polite distance from the next. Finally, I stopped at the end of a cul-de-sac. This was Aunt Vivian's house, a small ranch-style place, perhaps built in the 70s, that seemed untouched since then. The windows were dark, the lawn was overgrown, the grass reaching ankle height, suggesting no one had tended it for months. The driveway was cracked, weeds pushing through the concrete. The house seemed to scream. Someone died here, and no one knows what to do with it yet. I turned off the car and sat for a minute, trying to steady my nerve. Aunt Vivian had given me an address and promised that the truth awaited. But what if that truth was worse than the lies? What if whatever I found in this house made everything more complicated instead of providing the clarity I desperately craved? But I was too far in to stop. I took the second key from the suitcase, sealed in a small envelope marked house, and stepped out. The front door was locked, but the key turned smoothly. I stepped into a space that smelled stale, old, and undisturbed. The particular scent of a place where no one had opened a window, cooked a meal, or truly lived in months. The interior was exactly what my family had always described about Vivian's living situation. Books everywhere, stacked on shelves, piled on tables, and lined up along the baseboards. Filing cabinets dominated the living room, where a sofa should have been. Papers were organized in boxes with labels written in Vivian's precise handwriting. The kitchen looked barely used, just a coffee maker, a microwave, and a sink full of dishes that no one had washed before she died. But Aunt Vivian's note had directed me to the shed behind the house, not the house itself. I walked through the back door and stepped into an overgrown yard where grass and weeds had reclaimed what might have once been an attempt at a garden. The shed sat in the far corner, a small structure perhaps 10 by 12 feet, with newer locks than anything else on the property. That detail stood out immediately. Everything else looked old and neglected, but those locks were recent, industrial, the kind of hardware you use when you are protecting something truly important. I used the third key, marked shed. The lock opened with a clean click. Inside, the shed was organized in a way that made the house look chaotic by comparison. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with years, spanning from the 1980s until last year. Boxes were stacked along another wall, indexed with the precision you'd find in a professional archive. And in the back corner, partially hidden under a tarp and some strategically placed paint cans, there was a trap door set into the floor. I moved the paint cans and pulled back the tarp. The trap door had a handle and a lock. I tried the fourth key Vivian had left, the archive key, and it opened, revealing a metal ladder descending into darkness. My heart pounded. This wasn't a place for storing old papers. This was a bunker. I turned on my phone's flashlight and started climbing down. The air was cool and dry, maintained by a humming dehumidifier in the corner. The space was maybe 7 feet tall and 15 feet square, lit by battery-powered LED strips that flickered on when I reached the bottom of the ladder. This was a climate-controlled evidence room. More filing cabinets, more boxes, a table with an old laptop and a cassette player. Scattered throughout were photographs and documents protected in clear plastic sleeves. Aunt Vivian had spent her final years building this, a secret archive documenting something she believed was worth preserving, even if the world thought she was paranoid. I took a deep breath. I was no longer at the Starlight Inn. I was no longer the Eleanor who had been betrayed. I had stepped into the story of my mother and my aunt. I started with the photographs on the table because they were the first thing I saw. The truth, cold and undeniable, was waiting for me. I started with the photographs because they were right in front of me, arranged on the table like undeniable evidence in a criminal trial. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the first one I picked up. It was my mother, Charlotte Vance, standing between Bryce Sterling and Chelsea Hayes. All three were wearing business casual attire and name tags, smiling broadly at the camera like well-acquainted colleagues. The banner visible in the background read, Ethelgard Labs Annual Research Summit. The date, printed discreetly on the bottom edge of the photo, was 8 years ago. 8 years ago. That was 2 full years before I had supposedly met Bryce by chance at that dinner party in Atlanta. 2 years before he courted me. 2 years before he proposed. And 3 years before he married me. I stood there, frozen in the cool, dry air of the subterranean archive, my mind struggling to construct any rational explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe they'd briefly attended the same large conference. But I knew, deep down, that this was the shattering confirmation I had flown across the country for. This wasn't coincidence. This was the original blueprint. Bryce hadn't stumbled into my life by accident. He had been positioned there. He and Chelsea weren't merely adulterous lovers. They were collaborators, assets cultivated by powerful people who needed access to my mother's inner circle. They saw me as the easiest entry point. I was a target before I was a girlfriend, a mark before I was a wife. The realization was a deep, chilling cold that sank into my bones, worse than the betrayal in the bedroom. Every moment of intimacy, every whispered promise about our future, every I love you, it had all been a performance. 7 years of my life, meticulously calculated and executed to gain proximity to the woman Bryce was actually interested in, my mother. I gently set the photograph down and turned my attention to the stack of cassette tapes next to the old portable recorder. D. Vivian's handwriting labeled each one, dates, names, and brief descriptions. The next piece of the horrifying puzzle was waiting in analog. I picked up the top tape labeled Bryce Sterling and Richard Moss, March 2019. Discussion of Charlotte Vance investigation status. Richard Moss. I recognized the name immediately. He was the infamous, untouchable CEO of Ethelgard Labs, the pharmaceutical giant my mother had worked for. My chest tightened until it ached. I loaded the tape into the player, pressed play, and heard the hiss of static, followed by the voices that had defined and destroyed my adult life. The first voice was Bryce's, businesslike and utterly devoid of the warmth I had mistaken for love. "Charlotte's getting too close," Bryce said, his tone as cold as a boardroom table. "She's made copies of the trial data, and she's been meeting with someone at the FDA. I've been trying to find out who threw Eleanor, but Charlotte is protective. She thinks she's keeping her daughter safe by not involving her in whatever she's investigating." The second voice, older and authoritative, Richard Moss, responded, "We can't let this go public. The drug approvals we've secured are worth billions, and if she exposes the data manipulation, we're looking at criminal charges and the end of the company. Can you contain her through the daughter?" Bryce's response was frustratingly predictable. "Eleanor doesn't know anything useful. She's naive enough to be a perfect cover, but she's deliberately out of the loop on the substantive details." Moss's voice dropped, becoming heavy and menacing. "Then we need to consider other options, more permanent solutions. We can't risk everything because one accountant developed a conscience." I slammed the pause button. My stomach lurched. They were discussing killing my mother, planning it like a quarterly business review, weighing options and contingencies. Bryce, the man I had married, the man who swore to cherish me, was an active participant in the discussion to murder my mother. He'd used me as a path to information, and when I was useless, he moved on to strategizing her elimination. I took 3 shuddering breaths and pressed play again, forcing myself to listen to the horror. "There are ways to make it look accidental," Moss continued, chillingly calm. "We have people who specialize in this kind of problem. Car accidents happen all the time, especially on dangerous roads on rainy nights. No one questions those." The recording detailed logistics for another 20 minutes, discussing my mother's life and death with the same detached, strategic air one would use to plan an acquisition. Bryce's commitment, his willingness to strategize the murder of his future mother-in-law, all while continuing to court me. It showed a depth of depravity I hadn't even grasped when I found him with Chelsea. He was a willing, ambitious participant, compensated for every kiss and every declaration of love. I set that tape aside, my hand steady now, fueled by a terrifying clarity. My mother was murdered, because she developed a conscience. My husband was a hired operative. My entire life had been an intelligence-gathering operation. My personal heartbreak felt small compared to the magnitude of the conspiracy. I sat paralyzed on a concrete floor, the hum of the dehumidifier the only sound in the terrifying quiet of the bunker. The raw, nauseating realization of what I had just heard made the years of marital deception feel insignificant. Bryce hadn't simply betrayed me. He had actively participated in the planning of my mother's murder. That word, contain, echoed in my skull. They had viewed Charlotte as a problem, and when I, their chosen leverage, proved useless, they moved to eliminate the source. I forced myself to press the play button again, needing to absorb every cold, calculated word. What about afterward? Bryce asked on the tape, his voice returning to that practiced, emotionless tone. If Charlotte dies, Eleanor is going to be devastated. She'll lean on me for support, which gives me more access to her life. But there's also that Aunt Vivian. She's paranoid and suspicious of everything. If Charlotte dies, Vivian's going to start asking questions. Moss dismissed this concern with a chilling snort. Let her ask. Nobody takes Vivian Thorne seriously. She's been crying wolf about corporate corruption for decades. If she starts claiming Charlotte's death wasn't an accident, people will just think she's being paranoid again. The key is making sure there's nothing concrete for her to find. We clean up thoroughly, make sure the accident investigation is handled by people we can trust, and move on. The recording detailed logistics for another 20 minutes, discussing my mother's life and death with the same detached, strategic air one would use to plan an acquisition. Bryce's commitment, his willingness to strategize the murder of his future mother-in-law, all while continuing to court me. It showed a depth of depravity I hadn't even grasped when I found him with Chelsea. He wasn't coerced. He was a willing, ambitious participant, compensated for every kiss and every declaration of love. I set that tape aside, my hand steady now, fueled by a terrifying clarity. My mother was murdered because she developed a conscience. My husband was a hired operative. My entire life had been an intelligence-gathering operation. My personal heartbreak felt small compared to the magnitude of the conspiracy. I moved to the next set of tapes. These focused on Chelsea Hayes. The labels confirmed my deepest fear about my best friend. Chelsea Hayes and Dr. Sarah Chin, post-accident check-ins. Dr. Sarah Chin was, according to some of the early documents, a senior researcher at Ethelgard and, more critically, Chelsea's aunt. I played the first tape. Chelsea's voice, the familiar, comforting tone I'd relied on for years, was now laced with a cynical, professional edge. The girl is devastated, Chelsea reported to her aunt. She's completely broken and clinging to me. It's perfect. She doesn't suspect a thing about Charlotte's investigation or the accident. I'm confirming the isolation. Every Thursday night, I feed her wine and let her vent about Bryce. I reassure her he's busy or stressed and encourage her to trust him, to ignore her instincts. She's fully compliant and easily manageable. Dr. Chin's response was cold and clinical. Good. We need to ensure she doesn't inherit her mother's tendency toward moral outrage. Maintain the facade of best friendship. Continue the passive monitoring and make sure she never connects the dots between Bryce's corporate consulting, your position, and Ethelgard. The weight of this second betrayal, the manufactured nature of my decade-long friendship, hit me harder than Bryce's infidelity. I had chosen to marry Bryce, but Chelsea had been assigned to me. Every late-night talk, every tear shed on her shoulder, Every piece of advice she'd given me, it was all surveillance. Every Thursday wine night had been a debriefing session. She was paid to be my friend, paid to keep me isolated, paid to ensure I was too complacent to ever investigate my mother's death. The physical sensation was one of absolute emptiness. There was no one left to mourn. Every single relationship I had trusted, outside of the difficult, paranoid woman whose ghost now guided me, had been fabricated. I spent the next 2 hours moving methodically through the archive, reading documents, tracing financial payments to Bryce and Chelsea, piecing together the full, monstrous scope of the Ethelgard conspiracy. I was Eleanor Vance, and I had been living in a staged play directed by my mother's murders. The archive was my exit. The discovery of Chelsea's role, documented in cold, recorded detail, felt like the final, irrevocable fracture. Bryce's betrayal was understandable. He was a mercenary, a plant from the start. But Chelsea was supposed to be the constant, the one who navigated college dorms and bad breakups with me. To realize that every tear, every shared secret, every bit of wise advice was merely data collection for Ethelgard's protection was to realize I had never, for one moment, had a true best friend. The cassette recordings with Dr. Sarah Chin revealed the operational details. Chelsea was initially paid a generous retainer, masked as a graphic design contract, to maintain the friendship after Charlotte's death. Her objective was to gauge my grief, monitor any potential investigative curiosity, and most importantly, keep me close to Bryce so he could continue his role as a passive-aggressive controller. She's talking about her job, completely focused on the small stuff, I heard Chelsea say in one recording from a year after the accident. She's completely compliant, focusing on the mortgage and the apartment. She's forgetting the investigation ever existed. Forgetting the investigation. They hadn't just killed my mother. They had successfully orchestrated my cognitive blindness. I remembered countless small moments, now seen through this lens of cynical calculation. The time I suggested taking a weekend trip with Charlotte right before her death, and Chelsea aggressively encouraged me to stay home and focus on quality time with Bryce. The way she subtly diminished Aunt Vivian every time I brought her up, reinforcing the family narrative of the paranoid eccentric. She systematically dismantled every genuine tie I had, leaving only the fraudulent ones. The sheer exhaustion of having lived a decade without truth weighed down on me. I realized that my perceived naivety was less a fault in my character and more a testament to the sophistication of their coordinated psychological operation. Who questions the person standing next to them at the altar? Who questions the person they are drinking wine with every Thursday night? They relied on social custom, on human trust, to keep their secret safe. I had been too comfortable to notice. They had counted on my desire for a normal, stable, middle-class life to keep me from seeing the chaos they had built underneath. I found a document detailing the payments to Judge Robert Cunningham, the man who presided over my divorce. The payments, masked as consulting fees through a shell company, clearly linked him to Richard Moss and Ethelgard Labs. Cunningham hadn't just been biased, he was on the payroll. My humiliating divorce, the loss of my home, the destruction of my credit, all of it was a paid execution, designed to financially destroy me so completely that I wouldn't have the mental or fiscal capacity to look back and connect the dots. Vivian, bless her heart, had seen it all. She saw the threads of corporate corruption woven into the fabric of my personal life. She saw the danger in people with perfect smiles and convenient explanations. She had been collecting this evidence for 6 long, lonely years, knowing no one would believe her, knowing she couldn't risk revealing the archive until the right moment. The sheer act of her faith in me, the hope that I would eventually find the sanctuary and choose to fight, was a profound and unexpected gift. I realized I couldn't afford to wallow in the personal sadness of Chelsea's betrayal. That was the emotional response they wanted, for me to be too broken by the friendship to focus on the corporate conspiracy. But the stakes were higher than my personal heartbreak. My mother had died exposing a multi-billion-dollar fraud that affected public safety. This was no longer about Eleanor Vance's broken heart. It was about Charlotte Vance's legacy. I moved to the back corner of the archive, where a single laptop sat plugged into a power strip. A note was taped to the screen, written in Vivian's familiar cursive. "Play this first." It pointed to a video file named for Eleanor. I opened the file. It was time to hear from the mastermind herself. I wiped the dust from the screen, took one last look at the stacks of evidence that represented a decade of lies, and clicked play, ready for the final piece of the puzzle. Aunt Vivian's face filled the screen. She looked exactly as I remembered from our last family holiday. Visibly frail, her face drawn, but her eyes were sharp, focused, and intensely blue. She wore a navy blue cardigan I recognized, the same one she'd worn to almost every family gathering for the last decade. It was unsettling, seeing her so alive on the screen, knowing she was gone. "Eleanor," she began, her voice steady despite the visible illness. "If you're watching this, it means I'm dead and you found my archive. You are probably angry, confused, and wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was alive." She paused, taking a slow sip of water from a bottle beside the camera. "The answer is I tried. I warned you about Bryce at your engagement party. I pulled you aside and told you to be careful, that something about him felt wrong. I told you to watch how Chelsea behaved around him. You thought I was being paranoid. You said I saw conspiracies everywhere and needed to let you live your own life without interference." Her expression softened, and the deep-seated guilt I carried about dismissing her resurfaced. "And I don't blame you for that. I spent decades being the family member everyone dismissed as eccentric. By the time I tried to warn you about Bryce, you'd already learned to dismiss everything I said." She leaned forward, her voice becoming urgent. "Your mother, Charlotte, was my best friend. We grew up protecting each other. When she discovered what Ethelgard Labs was doing, manipulating clinical trial data to rush dangerous drugs to market, she came to me first. We spent months building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to go to the federal authorities." She coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. When she pulled it away, I saw a faint trace of blood on the white fabric. Then she died in that convenient accident, and I knew exactly what had happened, even though I couldn't prove it yet. I've spent the last 6 years of my life collecting the evidence you're sitting with right now. I did it because I loved your mother, and I love you. I couldn't let them get away with killing Charlotte and destroying your life without consequences. Vivian looked directly into the lens, her intensity making it feel like she was in the room. "You have 2 choices, Eleanor. Just like your mother had 2 choices before they killed her. You can take the $75,000 and disappear. Change your identity, move somewhere far away, and live safely. Nobody would blame you for choosing survival over justice. You deserve peace if that's what you want." She paused, her breath catching slightly. "Or you can fight. You can use everything I've collected and expose these people. Expose Ethelgard. Expose Bryce, Chelsea, and everyone who participated in your mother's murder and your destruction. It won't be easy. They have money, lawyers, political connections. You will be threatened. You will be harassed. But Eleanor, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you don't win completely, you'll make them pay a price for what they did. She smiled, that crooked, knowing smile I remembered from my childhood. Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you no matter what you choose. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night. Vivian then delivered the final, most crucial piece of information, reaching for a small notepad off camera. Oh, and there's one more thing I haven't mentioned in the written materials. Mountain Pacific Credit Union, account number 8114. Password is your mother's employee number from Ethelgard. That's the real fortune. The $75,000 in the suitcase is just travel money. Use what's in that account to fight, or use it to run. But for God's sake, use it. The video ended, and the screen went black. I didn't move for a long time. $75,000 was survival money, but the account number, that was freedom money. Vivian hadn't just collected evidence. She had built a financial fortress, so I could wage war without being instantly destroyed by legal fees. I finally understood the scope of her devotion. I pulled out my phone and searched for the credit union's number. I was about to call the Wealth Management Division. The call to Mountain Pacific Credit Union felt surreal, an utterly mundane transaction layered over a reality-bending conspiracy. I navigated the automated menus for what felt like an eternity before reaching a representative. When I gave them the account number and, after a tense moment, confirmed my identity using Charlotte's old employee number as the password, the representative's voice instantly shifted from bored to intensely professional. "Ma'am," she said, "finally, I need to transfer you immediately to our Wealth Management Division. Please hold." The classical piano hold music played while I sat in the dirt, surrounded by evidence of murder, waiting to discover the extent of my inheritance. After what seemed like an hour, a woman named Patricia came on the line. She explained in careful, measured language that Aunt Vivian had established a trust in my name 6 years ago. The trust wasn't just cash. It included stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights that Charlotte had secured before her death. The total current value is approximately $15 million, Patricia stated, her voice steady. It's structured to protect it from legal challenges and ensure that only you can access it. $15 million. The number was abstract, an amount of wealth I couldn't properly comprehend. Vivian had spent 6 years not just collecting evidence, but ensuring that when I found the truth, I would have the resources to hire the best lawyers, the best investigators, and actually win. She had wrapped justice like a gift, fully funded and ready to deploy. There was no longer a question of running. I chose to fight, using the contact information Vivian had left in a sealed envelope, a name written on FBI stationery. I called Agent Maria Torres at the FBI's Portland field office. "This is Torres," a sharp, efficient voice answered on the third ring. "My name is Eleanor Vance," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "My aunt, Vivian Thorne, left me information about a case I think you've been trying to build about Ethelgard Labs." The silence on the other end was instant and absolute. It stretched for 4 agonizing seconds. "Where are you right now?" Maria asked, her tone changing completely, now alert, focused, and intense. "Lake Oswego at my aunt's property. Don't leave. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't touch anything else. And whatever Vivian left you, just wait for me. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She hung up before I could respond. Maria Torres arrived in 35 minutes. She was in her late 40s, practical and intense, with an FBI badge clipped to her blazer. She looked at me, standing amidst the tall grass, with an expression that was a fascinating blend of skepticism and desperate hope. I led her to the shed, down the ladder, and into the cool, silent archive. Maria didn't speak for 20 minutes. She put on latex gloves, pulled files, loaded the cassette player, and read the meticulously labeled documents. Her skepticism melted away, replaced by an expression of professional awe. Your aunt was either the most paranoid woman in America or the most brilliant investigator I've ever encountered, Maria finally said, looking up from a diagram showing funds transfer. Probably both. This is enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy charges, massive fraud, and possibly murder. Eleanor, you just handed me a case that could topple a major pharmaceutical company. The investigation that followed moved with the bureaucratic thoroughness I would soon learn was normal when targeting billion-dollar corporations. Maria helped me find a small, quiet, one-bedroom apartment in Portland, modest, with hardwood floors and windows that rattled when the train went by 2 blocks away. It was a humble dwelling, but it felt infinitely more honest than the false luxury of the Atlanta condo. I used the money from Vivian's trust to pay rent and live simply, conserving resources for the inevitable legal battles. I met with prosecutors every few weeks, answering detailed questions about Bryce's schedule, Chelsea's surveillance check-ins, and my mother's final months. I had done my part. I had provided the weapon. Now, all I could do was wait for the machinery of justice to grind into motion. Maria's updates were always the same. We're making progress, and don't talk to anyone. The waiting was harder than the discovery, but I knew, finally, that I was not alone. 6 months after that first meeting with Maria Torres in the underground archive, the bureaucratic slowness of the federal government suddenly accelerated into a swift, coordinated strike. I was at my small apartment working on a freelance report when the news broke. Ethelgard Labs headquarters in Philadelphia was raided by federal agents. The images, broadcast across every national news network, were astonishing. Employees standing in the parking lot looking shell-shocked while agents and FBI windbreakers methodically carried boxes of evidence out of the gleaming glass monument to corporate success. It was the moment the untouchable empire began to fall. Later that morning, Richard Moss, the CEO whose voice I had heard planning my mother's murder, was arrested at his sprawling estate in the suburbs. News cameras captured the perp walk, showing him being led out in handcuffs, past his bewildered neighbors and the shouting reporters. He maintained a mask of arrogance, but his life, built on fraud and death, was collapsing in real time. Maria called me that afternoon to confirm the next piece of information that made my heart pound. Bryce Sterling had been arrested at his new tech startup office in Seattle. I watched the footage on the local news. Bryce, composed, trying to look inconvenienced rather than terrified, walking with his head held high. But I saw it, a flicker in his eyes, a mixture of fear and pure, cold disbelief, as if he genuinely thought he was immune from consequence, and was only now realizing how wrong his calculation had been. The man who had pretended to love me for 7 years, the architect of my financial destruction, was finally behind bars. Chelsea Hayes was arrested 2 days later at a boutique design studio she had started with the money she'd earned from Ethelgard surveillance. The news reports claimed she cried hysterically during her arrest. The tears, to me, felt utterly performative. I remembered the cold annoyance on her face in my bedroom, the cynical detachment in her voice on the tapes. Her attorney immediately issued a statement claiming she was a victim, manipulated by Bryce and Moss, and that she had no knowledge of the conspiracy's full extent. But I had heard the recordings of her conversations with Dr. Chin. Chelsea hadn't been manipulated. She had been a willing, active participant who cultivated our friendship deliberately to ensure my isolation. Every Thursday wine night was surveillance. Every hug was calculated. The betrayal from her, the sheer waste of a decade of my emotional investment, cut deeper than Bryce's crime. Then came the unexpected, delicious turn of justice. Documents collected by Vivian exposed Judge Robert Cunningham, the man who had presided over my brutal divorce. He resigned from the bench, the standard spend more time with family boilerplate, but was indicted 3 weeks later for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. Vivian's evidence showed he had purchased a vacation home through a trust that traced directly back to Moss's operations. Every case Cunningham had presided over in the last decade was reviewed. My divorce case was one of the first. A new judge took only 15 minutes to determine the original ruling was based on fabricated testimony and systematic bias. Everything Cunningham had decided was immediately vacated. Maria called with the final, official confirmation. "Eleanor, your marriage to Bryce is being annulled due to pervasive fraud, not finalized as a divorce. The court is declaring it invalid from the beginning. You're also getting a formal apology from the judicial system, for whatever that's worth." It was worth something, not enough to erase the months of humiliation or undo the trauma, but it was acknowledgement, official, legal recognition that what had been done to me was wrong, calculated and coordinated. The lie that had defined 7 years of my life was officially erased, replaced by the cold, clean dignity of truth. The ground had shifted beneath me again, but this time it was the ground under their feet that gave way. The long war had begun, and the first battle was won. The trials that followed the mass arrests were long, stretching across a year and a half. Maria Torres had warned me about the bureaucratic slowness of prosecuting interconnected corporate crimes, and she was right. The legal process ground forward with the meticulous, tedious thoroughness that makes justice feel less like a dramatic confrontation and more like a slowly moving glacier. Richard Moss, the CEO, went to trial first. His case was a media spectacle that dominated news cycles for weeks. Whistleblowers testified about the culture of fraud at Ethelgard, describing how they manipulated trial data for drug approvals. Patients who had been harmed by dangerous medications my mother had tried to stop, shared their devastating stories. The most compelling testimony came from forensic accountants, using Vivian's documents, who connected executive bonuses directly to falsified approvals, showing how Moss had personally profited from every dangerous drug the company brought to market. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They returned guilty verdicts on 17 counts, including conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and reckless endangerment. Moss, 62, was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison and ordered to forfeit approximately $40 million in assets. As I watched the bailiffs lead him away, I felt a strange sense of balance, not satisfaction, but the quiet click of a complex mathematical equation finally resolving itself. Bryce's trial was smaller, quieter, but infinitely more personal. I attended every day, sitting in the back row, a quiet witness to the unraveling of my fraudulent marriage. Prosecutors presented Vivian's recordings, and the court heard Bryce's voice discussing my mother like she was an obstacle, and heard him strategize about using our marriage for intelligence gathering. They presented the bank records showing his payments throughout our 7 years together. His defense attorney tried to paint him as a low-level participant coerced by Moss. But the tapes showed a willing, opportunistic mercenary who continued to receive payments and strategize long after Charlotte's death. When the verdict was read, guilty on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. Bryce looked across the courtroom, his eyes meeting mine. His expression was a final, complicated mix of anger and self-pity, as if he still couldn't believe that the naive woman he'd married as a means to an end was the one who ultimately brought him down. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. I looked back without flinching. I was done being intimidated. Chelsea accepted a plea deal rather than facing trial. In exchange for testimony against other high-ranking Ethelgard employees, her sentence was reduced to 8 years. 6 months after her sentencing, a letter arrived at my new Portland address. 3 pages, written on prison stationery, full of apologies and explanations about how she'd been young and desperate for money, and how being assigned to befriend me had started as a job but had become complicated. She asked if we could eventually find a way to forgive each other. I read the letter once while sipping my morning coffee, feeling nothing. It was self-justification dressed up as remorse, an attempt to rewrite history so she could see herself as a victim, not an active participant in my destruction. She wanted absolution I was not obligated to give. I filed the letter in a folder labeled Evidence and never replied. Some relationships cannot and should not be repaired. The final element was the civil lawsuit against Ethelgard Labs. The company fought aggressively for 2 years, deploying armies of lawyers. But facing the criminal convictions of their entire executive suite, they finally settled. The terms were staggering. Ethelgard was required to pay $3.5 billion to patients who had been harmed by their fraudulent drug approvals. My mother's estate received $10 million in wrongful death damages. It was a staggering sum, earned through her murder. But I already had the $15 million trust from Vivian. The money felt tainted. I inherited it, and I decided what to do with it immediately. The final act of justice had begun. The $10 million in wrongful death damages felt like blood money. I donated every dollar of it to organizations that advocate for pharmaceutical safety and transparency. Groups fighting the exact battles my mother had fought in secret. I didn't need it, and I refused to profit from the circumstances of her murder. Instead, I channeled the clean, strategic resources of Aunt Vivian's trust into building something that truly mattered, the Thorne Vance Foundation, named for the 2 women who saved me. This was my full-time work, my way of transforming grief and anger into a productive, living legacy. The foundation is a non-profit organization dedicated to investigating pharmaceutical fraud and supporting whistleblowers who risk everything to expose corporate misconduct. We hired investigators, people who thought like Vivian, methodical and tenacious. We funded legal defenses for employees facing retaliation after reporting problems. We published reports that made pharmaceutical companies desperately uncomfortable, shining light into corners where they preferred darkness. I still live in that modest Portland apartment. I keep the original receipt from my last week at the Starlight Inn, room 212, in my wallet. It's my most important possession. It serves as a stark, cold reminder that rock bottom is real, that humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you. But they can't actually destroy you unless you let them. Vivian had understood this. She spent her final years not seeking revenge, but building a pathway to justice. She believed truth mattered more than comfort, and justice mattered more than safety. The paranoid and everyone dismissed was the only one who truly understood how the world worked. That powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you trust them or play by rules they ignore. I am not the Eleanor Vance who walked out of that motel. That woman didn't understand how much she could survive or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. I am stronger, more careful about trust, but also more certain about what truly matters: dignity, resilience, and the power of a documented truth. The lesson I learned, the final truth Vivian left me, proved prophetic. Fighting doesn't always guarantee a win, but not fighting guarantees a loss. I built a meaningful life from the ruins of a fraudulent one. It's messy, complicated, and fundamentally honest. It's the kind of ending my mother and Dee Vivian would have appreciated. A story that reminds people that patience, documentation, and a determined heart can topple empires built on lies. The legacy of the two women who loved me enough to fight for me is now helping others fight for themselves. And I am finally sleeping at night. Thank you for letting me share my story, the full, unvarnished truth of how my life was dismantled and rebuilt. If you've experienced systematic betrayal or felt overlooked by those in power, what was the small moment that finally gave you the clarity to fight back? Share your thoughts below.